Yeah, so a little bit about me and my history really I think is the important part. Being part of the original PhoneGap team means that we actually have a CLI that's, I think it's basically 10 years old already. So completely built on Node.js. We have a whole plugin architecture more in the Cordova side that is all distributed via NPM. So there's a lot of learnings that I'd like to share with you that I think will help the future of oclif and when we start actively contributing a little bit more. So PhoneGap CLI has some vanity metrics here. 3K users in the last 7 days, 4,000 weekly downloads. More on those in a bit. So also being part of the Cordova CLI it's a much bigger project. So 61,000 users in the last 7 days and 110,000 weekly downloads on NPM. Still, even though contribution to the project in general has sort of fallen off a bit because it's become a mature, more stable project, there's still adoption out there. There's a lot of use. So I'm not really here to explain the difference between Cordova and PhoneGap, which is a question that we used to get asked all the time. I'll use the terms interchangeably. They sort of just mean hybrid mobile applications that are packaged and distributed in app stores. So yeah, 3 slides about me, but here we go. So at Adobe on our team, we're the developer tools team and cloud native applications. And we've been working actually on a CLI for a while, for the last year and a bit. We originally built it to support Adobe Runtime. And if you're not familiar with Runtime, Runtime is an Adobe-centric installation of OpenWhisk that it's targeted at users who want to integrate with our own cloud platform APIs. So we built it ourselves. It was painful to get started, but we were confident that we could do it well because we had a wealth of experience within PhoneGap and within Cordova. And not just me, but a lot of our team actually came from that background. So we did have extensibility in mind, but we were more thinking about just how other teams at Adobe could supply their own plugins. So not how we could write a CLI that itself was extensible. So we had dynamic subcommands that we processed at runtime. It was fast, it was lightweight, but we started getting more and more of a convention being thrown in. Like, how do you handle help? How do you do it generically? Well, you tell people that they have to do it this way. So we grew, and then we discovered oclif, and we said, this solves a lot of our problems. Specifically, the first one was how to install plugins. That was the big killer feature for us. So our transition to oclif was actually pretty easy. We were Node.js already, so a lot of times it was just changing how we process arguments and subcommands. We didn't go the TypeScript route. We're old school. The simplicity of flags and args is a killer feature as well. Not having to choose between 16 different NPM-based ways of processing arguments is a good feature. And once you learn the conventions, you can actually move really quickly through developing a plugin in oclif. So we have some big goals. I have some big goals of my own, one of which is to be the Adobe CLI. So any team that is developing a CLI will be a plugin. That means that we don't want to develop all those plugins. We want teams to be able to easily develop their own. So we're working towards being a consistent tool with CLI access and having some values that we're adding to teams who choose to go our route. We also want to be runnable in CI/CD is a big deal. We also recognize that there might be people who already have tools in Java, Python, Go that they want to surface actually through a plugin. So we will be looking at some of that down the road. And also in our initial version of our CLI, we were looking at taking a Swagger definition of a web-bound API and wrapping it into a command so that that entire API simply became a plugin. So we'd like to bring some of that work into oclif and plugins. So the reaction from some of the other teams, the biggest one is, can we get rid of the colon? People aren't a fan of colon as a separator, and we had to perform a colonectomy to actually get rid of it. And I can show you a little bit about how we did that. So basically what we did is we decided that we could get the list of all the known topics at startup. And using that list, we could take everything between the initial CLI command and the first flag, and we could concatenate that into an actual colon delimited topic, and we can see if it exists. If it doesn't exist, then we throw off the last one, we try again. So we go through a loop until we actually find a topic that exists. So this works for topics and subcommands equally well in plugins, outside of plugins, as long as they come in through your CLI. Now, the only caveat is that if you have an argument value that equals a topic, then you're going to have an issue. But I think the chance of that is relatively rare, but it is still possible. So that's how we got around that, and that's something that we would like to contribute back to oclif. We have to figure out how to actually do that the best way. We've right now it's very focused on our needs, but we have to generalize it. We also have to possibly look at the way help is formatted, because help is still formatted with a semicolon in it, and it'd be nice if, however the user is using it as maybe a preference, would be the way that it's displayed to them. So, as I said, getting out to other teams, I think it's a big sell to not have to use Commander, Yargs, Minimist, Optimist, all of these individual command line parsing, flag processing libraries, right? And I think oclif does a great job. So we do have some work to do to evangelize the way oclif does it inside of Adobe. So some other things that come up. How do we see what plugins are available? This is a big one. We don't have a ton of plugins right now, but we do, and some people would like to know what they're missing. So I do have what I call the disco command. Okay, here is the CLI. It's actually run as AIO, which is Adobe I/O, which is our wider org at Adobe. Eventually, I hope it will just be Adobe, whatever the subcommand is, but that's a road that I've got to work on. And I'm going to show you discovery, or discover. So essentially, I'm querying npms to get a list of plugins that match AIO CLI plugin. And then from that, I'm actually making sure that they're scoped to Adobe before I actually display them. This is something that we did in Cordova. We started out with our own registry, and we realized that it's better to just leverage the ecosystem, and you can actually use the ecosystem tag, and you can search for your plugins easily that way. So we also have the ability to install directly from that, if I can spell it. So there's only one plugin that I don't have installed, and that's the PhoneGap build one, so I can I can go and do that easily from there. So, and this applies to only the Adobe scoped plugins. Oops. And there's a list. I'm a big fan of using link as well. And I think this is probably informative that I'm actually showing you my command line and how I interact with it. Let me just jump back to slides here. Okay, so some of the things that we've done that are sort of big. We have an extensive configuration that we use. And this encompasses environment variables, local environment variables stored in a file that's .aio, and as well as a global config. So all of these values get pushed together into one configuration that any plugin can actually ask for. So I can show you a bit of this. I'll also show you a bit of the runtime plugin. What we've done is eventually we're going to have our own API surface in the CLI for how you interact with runtime. So there's already an open Whisk CLI, which does a great many things. There's also a Whisk deploy CLI, which does some other things. So we've encapsulated all of that into the runtime plugin. And cloud native apps, we want to make it easy to interact with those. They're not really a thing yet, but they will be cloud-backed, static resources, web-hosted applications. So with the database component, not unlike Heroku. Okay, and show you configuration. Okay, so AIO config. What we're going to see right now, and you can don't write down there's a private key in here, okay? But what you can see is actually all the configuration that I've stored here, and we can even do something like we can go that, and then we can go AIO config, and you'll see that it's actually turned the AIO prefix underscore into a variable, and it's actually spit it out in the same configuration. So this would be available to any plugin that's actually using our configuration module, and they can deal with them uniformly. And similarly, I can create nested objects. So now my var becomes an object that I can add to. And similarly, I can do this with .env files or a .aio file in the current directory. So this lets you have configuration that lives with the project that you're working on. You can move around. We also support YAML output and input as well for adding configuration values. Pardon me? You can do it within YAML. So within a YAML file, you can. What you're seeing actually when I do this isn't JSON. Actually, it's HJSON. So it's formatted a little nicer and a little more readable than straight up JSON. But if you want straight up JSON because you're going to do something else with it, there's the bleh. So you can use that directly. And you can also, you can pipe this into JQ and spit out just a portion of it. So JQ allows you to do a query on incoming JSON values. So you can pipe it straight through. So that's one of the big things that we've done that we think is pretty cool. If I do Whisk help, you can see that they've got a whole bunch of commands. Commands have sub-commands like action, Help action has a bunch of subcommands, so we can actually do in much the same way AIO runtime. We can see we've got subcommands here. We can go runtime action. And you can see we've got similar subcommands. So, and this still works with this, just so you don't think I'm magic or something. It's still in there. So, but that was one of the big things that we wanted to do with runtime is right now we have added some shortcuts like how to output JSON. Our version is a little less wordy. There's not like OK printed when you do an action. We expect that just the return code or the exit code is enough for most people. How am I doing on time? So back to the numbers that I talked about, telemetry. We actually, in the early Cordova days, like 8 years ago, or probably 5 when we added telemetry, we went and we just did Google Analytics. We dropped Google Analytics into Cordova, and we wanted to know what commands people were using. So it's less about the vanity metric of how many commands are being issued. It's what errors are people having, what commands are they trying, which maybe actually should be commands, like ls instead of list everywhere that you use list. It's so easy to add an alias for that if you see that happen, why not just go and do it? And then your user is just satisfied when things just work. So where am I at time? Well, I'm doing good. Okay. So I can show you a little bit of, I bet you're going too fast now. Analytics says right now there's one user, that's me, because I'm the only one who has this analytics plugin installed. Oh. I have to experiment with that. Okay, so right now on Google Analytics, there's one user using the CLI, and you can, if you drill down, you can actually see what commands I'm doing: config, discover, plugins, plugin install, runtime, and you can see how many users are using the colon or not using the colon as well. Actually, no, I think I'm dumping it all. I'm reformatting it so it's oclif-like. But another feature could be actually telling you what percentage of users are actually using the colon or the space or the semicolon if they can't make up their mind. And this data gets a little more interesting when we get into Cordova CLI. So we can see there's a lot more usage right now. We can see where people are. Brazil is really big. And the way that there's a couple ways that you can approach using like shoehorning Google Analytics into a CLI. One is that you can take the page model, where it's like every command is a page, and that's the way that we did the analytics for Cordova. So site content, all pages. So the interesting part about the numbers here, if you want to get into the vanity metrics, is of course all of this is opt-in. And if you look at the opt-in numbers or the opt-out numbers, you can see that 90% of users are opting out. So I don't want to completely speculate on what the actual numbers are, but it's probably roughly 10 times what is actually reported here for usage. And I think that's pretty impressive. I think that's pretty encouraging to anyone who's working on the project. And if there's no privacy information in there, then I think it's awesome. So this is something that I think we'd like to find a way to contribute to oclif as just a generic plugin that you can use. So currently, I don't know of a way that you can configure a plugin that the end user is going to install into your CLI, which I think is the problem that we need to solve, right? Because you want it tied to your asset in analytics. So there is, I worked on a little bit on a feedback plugin, and I can get into some of the things that you can see. I'll just demo this really quick. So I wanted to, like before this conference, I thought about other interesting things that we could do inside a CLI that you might not think of in a normal CLI. And one of them was feedback. But the first iteration for me was what's available on the system. This isn't necessarily feedback, but this is the actual error log. So if a user needs to report that they're having an issue, then giving them an easy way to get this error log is probably a pretty good idea. So then my next iteration was, well, in my package JSON of the CLI, I've specified a bugs URL, which is going to point to my GitHub. So why don't I just send them there if they have feedback? And we can just open a browser. They're there. They're on the Issues tab, and they can go and they can do an issue. But issues aren't necessarily feedback. So the next approach I came up with was actually inspired by the sign-up form for this talk. Right? Google makes it super easy for you to go and make a form. And you can specify whatever fields you want in that form. So why don't I just create a form, and then I'll just send users there. So now you can see I have an Adobe I CLI form, and I can put my name and put in my thoughts and share them with the developers. So the next iteration, going a little deeper each time, is if you actually go into the source code here, you can pick out the form fields. And so why not just dig in there, and we can actually prompt the user. So we'll use inquirer. We'll actually ask them for the values, and we'll post them ourselves. Eliminate the middleman. So now we have, what's your name? Thanks for your feedback, Jesse. And then we can go straight here. Is it going to let me see results? I think only I can do this. No. Anyway, it's in there. I just don't appear to be logged in. Okay, responses. So individual responses, and these are all me, by the way, on this machine. But you can see, like, it's going to be number 10, of course. You suck was in there. Encouraging myself as I go. Keep it up. And there's the last one. So I thought that was an interesting approach. Discovering that you can store stuff in the package JSON is sort of a pretty good way to let developers install your plugin into their CLI, but still have it retain their property and not make them run like a config command to set some value. Right? You can actually store whatever you want in that package JSON of your root CLI and access it that way. So that was a pretty good discovery too. So yeah, there's my feedback link. Anyone can remember that? Yeah, so that's just some thinking that I've done on what else we could bring into oclif. But overall, I just want to say that we love the project. It's done everything that we need it to, and we found out how to do the things that it didn't, and we definitely would like to contribute those things back. So I'm quick. Thank you. Thank you.
As a user of the Heroku CLI, when I have a question, I have the luxury that I can go to Slack and bug Felipe, or previously Jeff. It seems like that what you showed there could be really useful for kind of better organizing and providing a nice kind of streamlined process for collection of not just feedback. Feedback's great, but like, I think something's broken or I'm having a problem.
Yep.
What do I do for help? Especially if it's a small team that's responding to those problems. I kind of, whenever I go into Slack and bug Felipe, I'm kind of like feel bad that I'm pulling him off of whatever else he's working on. So it would be nice if there was like a streamlined way for me to say I need help with something. It's not urgent, but I'm having a problem with something. Do you think that could, like, that feedback plugin, I imagine it could auto-populate things like, oh, I'm on Mac OS whatever version,
Yep.
I'm using ZSH or Bash or whatever, other things that would help you kind of debug my problem?
Yeah, absolutely. Like showing everything that's in the log
Right.
sort of leads to it being a support channel where I didn't want to actually dump everything in my log into the cloud because I don't know what's in there. I haven't actually inspected everything, and I'm sure that there is private stuff in there. So you'd have to be careful with how you do that, but it could be you open the browser and you open the log and you say pick some of this non-identifiable information and paste it into the feedback form. Yeah. Or maybe locally you store the last run command always and the output log from that. And that's probably less likely to have a ton of historical information, so it's less likely to have anything private in it. And you could do something with that where that's shared.
That makes sense. I think that I remember something similar from the Keybase CLI now. I think there's a command in the Keybase CLI that effectively just like copies your logs to some place where the developers can get at it and gives you a unique URL for you then to paste into like your GitHub issue or whatever it is. But I don't know. There might be something interesting to learn from that user experience or what they've done there. Even though it's not
absolutely.
oclif.
It'd be interesting if you could put it on the clipboard too. So that they could just paste it.
I wanted to follow up with that because we've actually done this at Intuit. So there's an NPM package that will get your OS information for you and some other things. So we have what is it? Yeah, nvinfo. So we have a troubleshoot command that will scrape out the node environment information, the Mac OS version, et cetera, and how you installed it. And then from there, it'll also tell us what files you're changing on the branch. And then it copies it to clipboard, and we direct the person to paste it in our Slack. And that's how we're able to triage right now. But we're probably going to enhance some of that long term.
So yeah, one comment and one question. We also get kind of some requests for multi-language plugins. So yeah, whenever you guys do explore that, it'd be interesting to collaborate together because I think that's going to extend more than just a single CLI. Two, kind of not really oclif related, but we are also encouraging a bunch of teams to write plugins. And so one kind of challenge we get sometimes is not all teams, they have their own stuff they're working on, and they don't necessarily want to own a repo or own the CI/CD, all that kind of stuff. You kind of mentioned having some multi-configuration for CI/CD, all that kind of stuff. Can you elaborate a little bit more what you're doing there?
Yeah, we're using Travis for, let's see, let me fix my mirroring again. We're using Travis for all our tests, and we are maintaining 100% test coverage on line and branch. So if you go, where are we? If you go to Adobe and you filter by AIO CLI, you can see the plugins that we have right now, and some like these are all open source, but they're of limited use to anyone who's not familiar with the entire system right now. And there's some dependencies between these two. But one of the ones that might be interesting is just this repo, which is CLI Health. And all we've done here is every time that we add a new plugin, we go and we rip all those badges and we put it, and we can see what's happening with all of our plugins. So we can see, is everything healthy? Is everything passing tests? Of course, they all have the CLI oclif badge there. But you can see that the build is passing. And we're using Greenkeeper. We're running on, 3 versions of Node on Linux and on Windows, which gives us enough coverage to know that everything's not breaking on Windows. And if I show you, we're using Jest for all our testing. We do have, one of those repos is actually a boilerplate repo. So anyone who wants to make a plugin will just go along, they'll grab that, they'll clone it, they'll delete what's in the .git folder, and they'll git init themselves, and they'll rename a few things, and then they'll have tests set up. They'll have basically our ESLint rules in place and everything there to start with. And I could talk to you more about just the Travis setup. We also used to use AppFair before Travis supported Windows well. But now that it supports Windows, we're able to consolidate all of our tests on Travis.